The girl sought to prop herself up on her elbow, and instantly he knelt and raised her to a sitting position, her head resting against his shoulder. His hand touched her breast and came away red and wet. Tell me. His voice was soft, soothing, as one speaks to a babe. Les loups, she gasped, her voice swiftly growing weaker. He and his men descended upon our village, a mile up the valley. They robbed, slew, burned. That then was the smoke I scented, muttered the man. Go on, child. I ran. He, the wolf, pursued me and caught me. The words died away in a shuddering silence. I understand, child. Then he stabbed me with his dagger. Oh, blessed saints! Mercy! Suddenly, the slim form went limp. The man eased her to the earth and touched her brow lightly. Dead, he muttered. Slowly he rose, mechanically wiping his hands upon his cloak. A dark scowl had settled on his somber brow. Yet he made no wild, reckless vow. He swore no oath by saints or devils. Men shall die for this, he said coldly. And boy, did they! That is from the first published Solomon Kane story, Red Shadows. Yes, my friends, welcome to Stately Vaughan Manor and the second episode of The Robert E. Howard Show. Yes, The Robert E. Howard Show. Once again, every Monday, we will have this action-packed Robert E. Howard Show where we talk about the writings of the great Robert E. Howard, the greatest pulp writer who ever lived. And this week, we're going to be talking about Solomon Kane. I'm going to be talking about Solomon Kane for a while, because there are a few Solomon Kane stories, and I'm going to go over each one of them, each of the major stories anyway, in detail. But this week, we're just going to do an overview of this character. But before I do that, I want to show you this cool t-shirt that the lady of the manor got me for my birthday yesterday. I think it's really cool and appropriate for this show. It's a Robert E. Howard t-shirt that the lady of the manor got me for my birthday. It's really cool. I don't think I've ever seen a Robert E. Howard shirt before. So this is pretty cool. You won't actually see me wearing it because, you know, I've got standards to keep. But it's really cool to have. I like that. Thank you, lady of the manor, for getting me that shirt. So, Solomon Kane. He first appeared, like I said, in this story, Red Shadows, which appeared in Weird Tales magazine from August 1928. He got the cover spot, which was cool. It was a really good story, Red Shadows. You can tell it's an early story. You can tell it's an early Robert E. Howard story. Robert E. Howard is a guy that got a lot better. His writing got a lot better in a short amount of time. So you can tell this is an early story, but it's an excellent early story. Full of adventure and horror and action. It's great. Story of vengeance. And an excellent introduction to the character of Solomon Kane, who was an adventurer. He was a Puritan adventurer who lived in the late 16th through the early 17th centuries. And like I said, he was a Puritan and kind of a severe one. He's kind of a religious zealot. So not the kind of character you would expect from a series of swashbuckling adventure stories. But Robert E. Howard was creative that way, and he came up with this character years before he ever put him in a story. But once he started writing for Weird Tales in earnest, he remembered this character, and he started a whole series of Solomon Kane stories. Robert E. Howard did this thing where he would write a series of a character, then he would kind of lose touch with the character. And in his words, he felt he couldn't write realistically about that character anymore. He had moved on. So you'd have a series of Solomon Kane stories, and then a series of Cull stories, and the Bran McMorran stories. Fortunately, he stuck around with Conan for a while. for which I am grateful. We got a lot more Conan stories than we do about any of the other characters. All of Solomon Kane's stories fit handily in this one little volume. This is the Savage Tales of Solomon Kane from Del Rey Books. An excellent volume from Ballantine. Really cool. This one has illustrations in it from Gary Gianni. Yeah, Gary Gianni did the illustrations. That's a great title page where all the characters from the stories show up on the title page facing Solomon Kane there. Solomon Kane has been published since the pulp stories that he initially was published in Weird Tales. He was in a few random paperbacks. Banned Books a few years ago did a volume of Solomon Kane, which was an excellent volume. And oddly, it had a couple of stories in that volume finished by Ramsey Campbell, I believe, of all people, who doesn't seem like a Robert E. Howard kind of writer. But he was an admirer of Robert E. Howard, and he finished the stories, from what I remember, pretty well. If I'm remembering right, it was Ramsey Campbell who did that. But this collection here has all of the finished stories of Solomon Kane. There were a couple fragments that were finished in that other edition, but in this one they're just left alone as fragments. All of these stories and fragments were left as Robert E. Howard wrote them. There are a couple poems in here about Solomon Kane. Pretty good ones, too. So we'll be talking about those as well in the future. Excellent character, Solomon Kane. He's interesting. He went through a series of adventures. A lot of them took place in Africa, although he traveled all over. But some of the major stories took place in Africa. Red Shadows took place in Africa. The Hills of the Dead, which was a great story about these creatures who are vampires, but they kind of are like zombies. And Solomon Kane and his best friend Nalonga have to fight a whole monstrous village of these creatures. And it's great. There's also a story in here called Wings in the Night. Here's an illustration from that story, Wings in the Night. That is a dynamite story where Solomon Kane stumbles upon an African who has been horribly tortured and is dying. And of course, Solomon Kane, being the kind of guy he is, immediately finds this guy. And just like the young girl that he found in the beginning of Red Shadows, he decides, I will get justice for this man who has been horribly wronged and tortured. Whoever did this, I'm going after them. I'm going to take care of them. Because that's what he did. He would right wrongs wherever he found them. Turned out to be a little bit more complex, the situation with that guy. And it made a really interesting and one of his best horror stories, actually, Wings in the Night. Yeah, great stuff. I have to say, this volume has just some really cool illustrations all throughout the text, which are just really cool. It makes the reading experience a lot of fun. Some of the illustrations are great. This is another scene from Wings in the Night. So this is an excellent volume of swashbuckling fun with Solomon Kane. And he was interesting because while outwardly he was just what he said he was a dour Puritan, religious nut, zealot who thought he had a mission from God to travel the world and right wrongs and battle against evil. But he was a little bit more complex than that. Robert E. Howard makes it perfectly clear that Solomon Kane was actually driven also, if not more so, by just a lust for adventure. He was a man of action, and he had a wandering foot. He liked to travel, this guy. And so he did. And what he did was fight evil wherever he found it. And he was a very, very skilled swordsman. Very few who stood up against Solomon Kane survived. Although he did have a couple pretty challenging antagonists in his stories. But he also had at least one powerful friend in Nalanga. Nalanga is a character that he met in Red Shadows, and Nalanga was a recurring character who showed up a few different times in the stories. Nalanga was a shaman, an African shaman. He was a wizard, basically. And he had learned in his youth the secrets of magic and sorcery from some sorcerers and holy men in the Middle East and Near East. And so he learned all of this stuff, and he learned the ability to send his soul outside his body to inhabit either the living or the dead. So he could basically raise the dead with his own wandering soul. It's kind of creepy stuff. Nalanga is a really, really powerful character. Outwardly, he's just an old man. And you get the feeling he's a lot older than he looks. And a really interesting character. He's the type of character Solomon Kane should not like at all. He should totally hate this guy because, first of all, Nalanga's not Christian at all. He doesn't share Solomon Kane's religious beliefs. He's African. He's from this distant, strange land. So Solomon Kane should, not get on with this guy. It turns out, and initially Solomon Kane does kind of feel that way about Nalanga, but eventually he realizes that him and Nalanga are kind of the same in a lot of ways. They have a lot in common. They're kind of kindred spirits, actually. And so they end up getting along, and they actually become friends. And Nalanga gives Solomon Kane this staff. This is the Staff of Solomon. It has the head of a cat at the top of the staff. But this staff is ancient. It goes back to prehistoric times. Actually goes all the way back to the time of King Kull, actually. And the head of the staff used to be quite different. It was reformed into a cat's head, but it used to be something else entirely. And the staff does have magical abilities. It's really cool. There's a lot of really cool stuff in Solomon Kane. So Nalanga gives this staff to Solomon Kane to aid him on his adventures. And Nalanga takes part, actually, in a couple of these adventures. Most notably in Hills of the Dead. Really interesting character, really interesting relationship that those two have. And that's one of the things that's interesting about Solomon Kane, because even though this book is not terribly long, there were only a few stories featuring this character. In the course of those stories, Solomon Kane does change. His character grows. He starts realizing things about himself and about the world and how things aren't as black and white as he thought they were at the outset of his adventures. So it's kind of cool. He's a cool action character. He's different from most swashbuckling adventurers you will find. He's just a really different, really interesting character. And Robert E. Howard kind of shows the depth of his imagination that he came up with this character. And he came up with this character very early. This is, like I said, his earliest major adventure character. And so over the next few weeks, I'll be talking about the major stories. They did not appear in Weird Tales in the order that Robert E. Howard wrote them. The first story that he wrote was a story called Skulls in the Stars, which is kind of a little horror story. This volume has those stories in the order that they were written. I will be talking about Red Shadows first because it was the first published story, and I just think it's a really good introduction to the character of Solomon Kane. Excellent story. And then we will be getting on to some of the other major stories. I won't be talking about every story in this book, but I'll be talking about the most important stories in this book. So you just get an idea of what's in here and the character of Solomon Kane, who has kind of been around a little bit. Marvel Comics, of course, had great success with Conan, so they came out with a series of Solomon Kane comic books, which you could find in this Solomon Kane omnibus. This is an excellent, excellent illustration of Solomon Kane. This gives you a real idea, just this one fantastic cover design of the kind of character that Solomon Kane is. This is very much Solomon Kane right there. And this particular volume just has a lot of Solomon Kane stories. So you get some different artistic versions of Solomon Kane. It's really cool if you're interested in that sort of thing. There's Solomon Kane there. So he did exist with some Marvel Comics because they had such a success with Conan. They had to, try out all the other Robert E. Howard characters. They did the least with Solomon Kane. Probably because he was a character from history. He was not a fantasy character in the way that Conan was, and that Conan existed in a whole different world, even though it was in our world in the distant past. Solomon Kane has more of a feeling of reality to him, and that he exists in a world more directly connected with our own. So they didn't do as much with Solomon Kane, but what they did a really good job of. Solomon Kane has been in one film that came out in 2009 with James Purfoy was the actor, and he's good in everything. So he made an excellent Solomon Kane. The movie was interesting. It was kind of a Solomon Kane origin story. And we never really get the origin story of Solomon Kane in Robert E. Howard's fiction, although you get the idea that this is a lot different than what Robert E. Howard would have come up with. It's still an entertaining movie. It's not great cinema, but it was entertaining. And James Purfoy gave a really good performance, as he always does. So Solomon Kane has been around. But this is probably the best place. This is the best place, of course, to experience Solomon Kane and Robert E. Howard's original Solomon Kane stories in this particular volume, where you get them all exactly as Robert E. Howard wrote them, but with these really cool illustrations throughout the volume, which, like I said, makes it a heck of a lot of fun to read. So that was Solomon Kane. I'll shut up now. Next week, I will talk more about his debut story, Red Shadows, which is a heck of a story. So I will catch you next time.